Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, called the philosopher, was Roman emperor from 161 to 180. He ruled the Roman Empire with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus until Lucius' death in 169. He was the last of the rulers traditionally known as the Five Good Emperors. He is also seen as the last emperor of the Pax Romana, an age of relative peace and stability for the empire. His personal philosophical writings, now commonly known as meditations, are a significant source of the modern understanding of ancient Stoic philosophy. They have been praised by fellow writers, philosophers, and monarchs as well as by poets and politicians centuries after his death. Marcus was born into a Roman patrician family. His father was a praetor, after whose death in 124 Marcus was raised by his paternal grandfather, and his mother was a wealthy heiress. He was educated at home, as children from Roman aristocratic families often were, and later credited his maternal grandmother's stepfather Lucius Catulus Severus, who helped Marcus' grandfather to raise him for his education. His tutors included the artist Dionysius, who may have sparked his interest in philosophy, and Tudicius Proclus. Marcus was betrothed to the daughter of Lucius Aelius, his relative Emperor Hadrian's first adopted son and heir. Aelius died in 138 and Hadrian chose as his new heir Antoninus Pius, the husband of Marcus' aunt, on the condition that Antoninus adopt Marcus and the son of Aelius, Lucius Commodus. Antoninus became emperor later that year, and Marcus and Lucius became joint heirs to the throne. While imperial heir, Marcus studied Greek and Latin. His tutors included Herodes Atticus and Marcus Cornelius Fronto. He kept in close correspondence with Fronto for many years afterwards. Marcus was introduced to Stoicism by Quintus Junius Rusticus and perhaps by other philosophers such as Apollonius of Chalcedon. He was made a quaestor and the symbolic head of the Roman equites. He was appointed consul with Antoninus in 140 and 145, the year he married Antoninus' daughter Faustina the Younger, and with his adoptive brother Lucius in 161. On March 7, 161, Antoninus died and the two succeeded to the imperial throne. Marcus' reign was marked by military conflict. In the east, the Roman Empire fought successfully with a revitalized Parthian Empire and the rebel kingdom of Armenia. Marcus defeated the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians in the Marcomannic Wars. However, these and other Germanic peoples began to represent a troubling reality for the empire. Marcus modified the silver purity of the Roman currency, the denarius. Persecution of Christians is believed to have increased during his reign. The Antonine Plague that broke out in 166 devastated the population of the Roman Empire. It caused the deaths of 5 million people, a quarter of those it affected. Marcus never adopted an heir unlike some of his predecessors. He and Faustina had at least 13 children, including Lucilla, who married Lucius Verus, and Commodus, whom Marcus named as his co-ruler in 177. Marcus became the first emperor to die with a living, adult son since Titus succeeded his father Vespasian a century earlier, but Commodus is considered a disappointment as emperor, and his succession has long been the subject of debate among both contemporary and modern historians. The column and equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius still stand in Rome, where they were erected in celebration of Marcus' military victories. The major sources depicting the life and rule of Marcus are patchy and frequently unreliable. The most important group of sources, the biographies contained in the Historia Augusta, claim to be written by a group of authors at the turn of the 4th century AD, but were in fact written by a single author from about 395 AD. The later biographies and the biographies of subordinate emperors and usurpers are unreliable, but the earlier biographies, derived primarily from now lost earlier sources, are much more accurate. For Marcus' life and rule, the biographies of Hadrian, Antoninus, Marcus, and Lucius are largely reliable, but those of Aelius Verus and Avidius Cassius are not. A body of correspondence between Marcus' tutor Fronto and various Antonine officials survives in a series of patchy manuscripts, covering the period from c. 138 to 166. Marcus' own meditations offer a window on his inner life, but are largely undatable and make few specific references to worldly affairs. The main narrative source for the period is Cassius Dio, a Greek senator from Bithynian Nicaea who wrote a history of Rome from its founding to 229 in 80 books. Dio is vital for the military history of the period, but his senatorial prejudices and strong opposition to imperial expansion obscure his perspective. Some other literary sources provide specific details: the writings of the physician Galen on the habits of the Antonine elite, the orations of Aelius Aristides on the temper of the times, and the constitutions preserved in the Digest and Codex Justinianus on Marcus' legal work. Inscriptions and coin finds supplement the literary sources. Marcus was born in Rome on April 26, 121. His name at birth was supposedly Marcus Annius Verus, but some sources assign this name to him upon his father's death and unofficial adoption by his grandfather, upon his coming of age, or at the time of his marriage. He may have been known as Marcus Annius Catilius Severus at birth or at some point in his youth, or Marcus Catilius Severus Annius Verus. Upon his adoption by Antoninus as heir to the throne, he was known as Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus Caesar and, upon his ascension, he was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus until his death. Epiphanius of Salamis, in his chronology of the Roman emperors on weights and measures, calls him Marcus Aurelius Verus. Marcus' family originated in Ocubi, a small town southeast of Córdoba in Iberian Baetica. The family rose to prominence in the late 1st century AD. Marcus' great-grandfather Marcus Annius Verus was a senator and ex-praetor. His grandfather Marcus Annius Verus was made a patrician in 73-74. Through his grandmother Rupilia, Marcus was a member of the Nerva Antonine dynasty. Salonia Matidia, the Emperor Trajan's niece through his sister, was the mother of Rupilia and her half-sister, Hadrian's wife Sabina. Verus and Rupilia's elder son Marcus' father Marcus Annius Verus married Domitia Lucilla. She was the daughter of the patrician P. Calvisius Tullus Russo and Domitia Lucilla, who had inherited a great fortune from her maternal grandfather and her paternal grandfather by adoption. The younger Lucilla would acquire much of her mother's wealth, including a large brickworks on the outskirts of Rome, a profitable enterprise in an era when the city was experiencing a construction boom. Marcus' sister, Annia Cornificia Faustina, was probably born in 122 or 123. His father probably died in 124, during his praetorship, when Marcus was 3 years old. Though he can hardly have known his father, Marcus wrote in his meditations that he had learned modesty and manliness from his memories of his father and from the man's posthumous reputation. His mother Lucilla did not remarry and, following prevailing aristocratic customs, probably did not spend much time with her son. Instead, Marcus was in the care of nurses. Even so, he credits his mother with teaching him religious piety, simplicity in diet, and how to avoid the ways of the rich. In his letters, he makes frequent and affectionate reference to her. He was grateful that, although she was fated to die young, yet she spent her last years with me. After his father's death, Marcus was raised by his grandfather Marcus Annius Verus, who had always retained the legal authority of patria potestas over his son and grandson. Technically this was not an adoption, the creation of a new and different patria potestas. Lucius Catilius Severus, described as Marcus' maternal great-grandfather, also participated in his upbringing. He was probably the elder Domitia Lucilla's stepfather. Marcus was raised in his parents' home on the Caelian Hill, which he would affectionately refer to as my Caelian. It was an upscale area with few public buildings but many aristocratic villas. Marcus' grandfather owned a palace beside the Lateran, where he would spend much of his childhood. Marcus thanks his grandfather for teaching him good character and avoidance of bad temper. He was less fond of the mistress his grandfather took and lived with after the death of his wife Rupilia. Marcus was grateful that he did not have to live with her longer than he did. Marcus was educated at home, in line with contemporary aristocratic trends. He thanks Catilius Severus for encouraging him to avoid public schools. One of his teachers, Dionysius, a painting master, proved particularly influential. He seems to have introduced Marcus Aurelius to the philosophic way of life. In April 132, at the behest of Dionysus, Marcus took up the dress and habits of the philosopher. He studied while wearing a rough Greek cloak, and would sleep on the ground until his mother convinced him to sleep on a bed. A new set of tutors, Alexander of Cocium, Trogius Aper, and Tudicius Procellus, took over Marcus' education in about 132 or 133. Little is known of the latter two, but Alexander was a major litterateur, the leading Homeric scholar of his day. Marcus thanks Alexander for his training in literary styling. Alexander's influence and emphasis on matter over style and careful wording, with the occasional Homeric quotation, has been detected in Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. In late 136, Hadrian almost died from a hemorrhage. Convalescent in his villa at Tivoli, he selected Lucius Caius Commodus, Marcus' intended father-in-law, as his successor and adopted son in Vitus Omnibus, against the wishes of everyone. While his motives are not certain, it would appear that his goal was to eventually place the then too young Marcus on the throne. As part of his adoption, Commodus took the name Lucius Aelius Caesar. His health was so poor that, during a ceremony to mark his becoming heir to the throne, he was too weak to lift a large shield on his own. After a brief stationing on the Danube frontier, Aelius returned to Rome to make an address to the Senate on the first day of 138. The night before the speech, however, he grew ill, and died of a hemorrhage later in the day. On January 24, 138, Hadrian selected Aurelius Antoninus, the husband of Marcus' aunt Faustina the Elder, as his new successor. As part of Hadrian's terms, Antoninus in turn adopted Marcus and Lucius Commodus, the son of Lucius Aelius. Marcus became M. Aelius Aurelius Verus, and Lucius became L. Aelius Aurelius Commodus. At Hadrian's request, Antoninus' daughter Faustina was betrothed to Lucius. Marcus reportedly greeted the news that Hadrian had become his adoptive grandfather with sadness, instead of joy. Only with reluctance did he move from his mother's house on the Caelian to Hadrian's private home. At some time in 138, Hadrian requested in the Senate that Marcus be exempt from the law barring him from becoming quaestor before his 24th birthday. The Senate complied, and Marcus served under Antoninus, the consul, for 139. Marcus' adoption diverted him from the typical career path of his class. If not for his adoption, he probably would have become triumvir montalis, a highly regarded post involving token administration of the state mint. After that, he could have served as tribune with a legion, becoming the legion's nominal second in command. Marcus probably would have opted for travel and further education instead. As it was, Marcus was set apart from his fellow citizens. Nonetheless, his biographer attests that his character remained unaffected. He still showed the same respect to his relations as he had when he was an ordinary citizen, and he was as thrifty and careful of his possessions as he had been when he lived in a private household. After a series of suicide attempts, all thwarted by Antoninus, Hadrian left for Baia, a seaside resort on the Campanian coast. His condition did not improve, and he abandoned the diet prescribed by his doctors, indulging himself in food and drink. He sent for Antoninus, who was at his side when he died on July 10, 138. His remains were buried quietly at Puteoli. The succession to Antoninus was peaceful and stable. Antoninus kept Hadrian's nominees in office and appeased the Senate, respecting its privileges and commuting the death sentences of men charged in Hadrian's last days. For his dutiful behavior, Antoninus was asked to accept the name Pius. Immediately after Hadrian's death, Antoninus approached Marcus and requested that his marriage arrangements be amended. Marcus' betrothal to Cainia Fabia would be annulled, and he would be betrothed to Faustina, Antoninus' daughter, instead. Faustina's betrothal to Caiania's brother Lucius Commodus would also have to be annulled. Marcus consented to Antoninus' proposal. Antoninus bolstered Marcus' dignity. Marcus was made consul for 140, with Antoninus as his colleague, and was appointed as a Saviri, one of the Knights' 6 commanders, at the Order's annual parade on July 15, 139. As the heir apparent, Marcus became Princeps Iuventudis, head of the equestrian order. He now took the name Caesar, Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus Caesar. Marcus would later caution himself against taking the name too seriously. See that you do not turn into a Caesar, do not be dipped into the purple dye, for that can happen. At the Senate's request, Marcus joined all the priestly colleges. Direct evidence for membership, however, is available only for the Arval Brethren. Antoninus demanded that Marcus take up residence in the house of Tiberius, the imperial palace on the Palatine. Antoninus also made him take up the habits of his new station, the Aulesum fastigium or pomp of the court, against Marcus' objections. Marcus would struggle to reconcile the life of the court with his philosophic yearnings. He told himself it was an attainable goal where life is possible, then it is possible to live the right life. Life is possible in a palace, so it is possible to live the right life in a palace, but he found it difficult nonetheless. He would criticize himself in the Meditations for abusing court life in front of company. As quaestor, Marcus would have had little real administrative work to do. He would read imperial letters to the Senate when Antoninus was absent, and would do secretarial work for the senators. His duties as consul were more significant. One of two senior representatives of the Senate, he would preside over meetings and take a major role in the body's administrative functions. He felt drowned in paperwork, and complained to his tutor, Marcus Cornelius Fronto, "I am so out of breath from dictating nearly 30 letters." He was being fitted for ruling the state, in the words of his biographer. He was required to make a speech to the assembled senators as well, making oratorical training essential for the job. On January 1, 145, Marcus was made consul a second time. He might have been unwell at this time. A letter from Fronto that might have been sent at this time urges Marcus to have plenty of sleep so that you may come into the Senate with a good color and read your speech with a strong voice. Marcus had complained of an illness in an earlier letter. "As far as my strength is concerned, I am beginning to get it back, and there is no trace of the pain in my chest. But that ulcer, I am having treatment and taking care not to do anything that interferes with it." Marcus was never particularly healthy or strong. Cassius Dio, writing of his later years, praised him for behaving dutifully in spite of his various illnesses. In April 145, Marcus married Faustina, as had been planned since 138. Since Marcus was, by adoption, Antoninus' son, under Roman law he was marrying his sister. Antoninus would have had to formally release one or the other from his paternal authority for the ceremony to take place. Little is specifically known of the ceremony, but it is said to have been noteworthy. Coins were issued with the heads of the couple, and Antoninus, as Pontifex Maximus, would have officiated. Marcus makes no apparent reference to the marriage in his surviving letters, and only sparing references to Faustina. After taking the toga virilis in 136, Marcus probably began his training in oratory. He had 3 tutors in Greek: Anninus Macer, Canonius Celer, and Herodes Atticus, and one in Latin, Fronto. The latter 2 were the most esteemed orators of the day, but probably did not become his tutors until his adoption by Antoninus in 138. The preponderance of Greek tutors indicates the importance of the Greek language to the aristocracy of Rome. This was the age of the Second Sophistic, a renaissance in Greek letters. Although educated in Rome, in his Meditations, Marcus would write his inmost thoughts in Greek. Atticus was controversial, an enormously rich Athenian. He was quick to anger, and resented by his fellow Athenians for his patronizing manner. Atticus was an inveterate opponent of Stoicism and philosophic pretensions. He thought the Stoics' desire for a lack of feeling foolish. They would live a sluggish, enervated life, he said. Marcus would become a Stoic. He would not mention Herodes at all in his Meditations, in spite of the fact that they would come into contact many times over the following decades. Fronto was highly esteemed. In the self-consciously antiquarian world of Latin letters, he was thought of as second only to Cicero, perhaps even an alternative to him. He did not care much for Atticus, though Marcus was eventually to put the pair on speaking terms. Fronto exercised a complete mastery of Latin, capable of tracing expressions through the literature, producing obscure synonyms, and challenging minor improprieties in word choice. A significant amount of the correspondence between Fronto and Marcus has survived. The pair were very close. "Farewell, my Fronto, wherever you are, my most sweet love and delight. How is it between you and me? I love you and you are not here." Marcus spent time with Fronto's wife and daughter, both named Cratia, and they enjoyed light conversation. He wrote Fronto a letter on his birthday, claiming to love him as he loved himself, and calling on the gods to ensure that every word he learned of literature, he would learn from the lips of Fronto. His prayers for Fronto's health were more than conventional, because Fronto was frequently ill. At times, he seems to be an almost constant invalid, always suffering. About 1/4 of the surviving letters deal with the man's sicknesses. Marcus asks that Fronto's pain be inflicted on himself, of my own accord with every kind of discomfort. Fronto never became Marcus' full-time teacher, and continued his career as an advocate. One notorious case brought him into conflict with Atticus. Marcus pleaded with Fronto, first with advice, then as a favor, not to attack Atticus. He had already asked Atticus to refrain from making the first blows. Fronto replied that he was surprised to discover Marcus counted Atticus as a friend, and allowed that Marcus might be correct, but nonetheless affirmed his intent to win the case by any means necessary. He charges are frightful and must be spoken of as frightful. Those in particular which refer to the beating and robbing I will describe in such a way that they savor of gall and bile. If I happen to call him an uneducated little Greek, it will not mean war to the death. The outcome of the trial is unknown. By the age of 25, Marcus had grown disaffected with his studies in jurisprudence, and showed some signs of general malaise. His master, he writes to Fronto, was an unpleasant blowhard, and had made a hit at him. "It is easy to sit yawning next to a judge," he says, "but to be a judge is noble work." Marcus had grown tired of his exercises, of taking positions in imaginary debates. When he criticized the insincerity of conventional language, Fronto took to defend it. In any case, Marcus' formal education was now over. He had kept his teachers on good terms, following them devotedly. It affected his health adversely, his biographer writes, to have devoted so much effort to his studies. It was the only thing the biographer could find fault with in Marcus' entire boyhood. Fronto had warned Marcus against the study of philosophy early on. "It is better never to have touched the teaching of philosophy, than to have tasted it superficially, with the edge of the lips, as the saying is." He disdained philosophy and philosophers, and looked down on Marcus' sessions with Apollonius of Chalcedon and others in this circle. Fronto put an uncharitable interpretation of Marcus' conversion to philosophy, in the fashion of the young, tired of boring work. Marcus had turned to philosophy to escape the constant exercises of oratorical training. Marcus kept in close touch with Fronto, but would ignore Fronto's scruples. Apollonius may have introduced Marcus to Stoic philosophy, but Quintus Junius Rusticus would have the strongest influence on the boy. He was the man Fronto recognized as having wooed Marcus away from oratory. He was older than Fronto and 20 years older than Marcus. As the grandson of Aurelius Rusticus, one of the martyrs to the tyranny of Domitian, he was heir to the tradition of Stoic opposition to the bad emperors of the 1st century, the true successor of Seneca. Marcus thanks Rusticus for teaching him not to be led astray into enthusiasm for rhetoric, for writing on speculative themes, for discoursing on moralizing texts. To avoid oratory, poetry, and fine writing. On November 30, 147, Faustina gave birth to a girl named Domitia Faustina. She was the first of at least 13 children that Faustina would bear over the next 23 years. The next day, December 1, Antoninus gave Marcus the tribunician power and the imperium authority over the armies and provinces of the emperor. As tribune, he had the right to bring one measure before the Senate after the 4 Antoninus could introduce. His tribunician powers would be renewed with Antoninus on December 10, 147. The first mention of Domitia in Marcus' letters reveals her as a sickly infant. Caesar to Fronto. If the gods are willing, we seem to have a hope of recovery. The diarrhea has stopped, the little attacks of fever have been driven away. but the emaciation is still extreme and there is still quite a bit of coughing. He and Faustina, Marcus wrote, had been pretty occupied with the girl's care. Domitian would die in 151. In 149, Faustina gave birth again, to twin sons. Contemporary coinage commemorates the event, with crossed cornucopiae beneath portrait busts of the two small boys, and the legend Temporum Felicitas, the happiness of the times. They did not survive long. Before the end of the year, another family coin was issued. It shows only a tiny girl, Domitia Faustina, and one boy baby. Then another, the girl alone. The infants were buried in the mausoleum of Hadrian, where their epitaphs survive. They were called Titus Aurelius Antoninus and Tiberius Aelius Aurelius. Marcus stated himself, "One man prays, how I may not lose my little child, but you must pray, how I may not be afraid to lose him." He quoted from the Iliad what he called the briefest and most familiar saying, enough to dispel sorrow and fear. Leaves. The wind scatters some on the face of the ground. Like unto them are the children of men. Iliad 6.146. Leaves. The wind scatters some on the face of the ground. Like unto them are the children of men. Another daughter was born on March 7, 150, Annia Aurelia Galeria Lucilla. At some time between 155 and 161, probably soon after 155, Marcus' mother Domitia Lucilla died. Faustina probably had another daughter in 151, but the child, Annia Galeria Aurelia Faustina, might not have been born until 153. Another son, Tiberius Aelius Antoninus, was born in 152. A coin issue celebrates Fecunditatis Augusti, the Augustus fertility, depicting two girls and an infant. The boy did not survive long. On coins from 156, only the two girls were depicted. He might have died in 152, the same year as Marcus' sister Cornificia. By March 28, 158, when Marcus replied, another of his children was dead. Marcus thanked the Temple Synod, even though this turned out otherwise. The child's name is unknown. In 159 and 160, Faustina gave birth to daughters, Fadia and Cornificia, named respectively after Faustina's and Marcus' dead sisters. Lucius started his political career as a quaestor in 153. He was consul in 154, and was consul again with Marcus in 161. Lucius had no other titles, except that of son of Augustus. Lucius had a markedly different personality from Marcus. He enjoyed sports of all kinds, but especially hunting and wrestling. He took obvious pleasure in the circus games and gladiatorial fights. He did not marry until 164. In 156, Antoninus turned 70. He found it difficult to keep himself upright without stays. He started nibbling on dry bread to give him the strength to stay awake through his morning receptions. As Antoninus aged, Marcus would take on more administrative duties, more still when he became the praetorian prefect as Gavius Maximus died in 156 or 157. In 160, Marcus and Lucius were designated joint consuls for the following year. Antoninus may have already been ill. 2 days before his death, the biographer reports, Antoninus was at his ancestral estate at Lorium, in Etruria, about 19 kilometers from Rome. He ate Alpine cheese at dinner quite greedily. In the night he vomited. He had a fever the next day. The day after that, March 7, 161, he summoned the imperial council, and passed the state and his daughter to Marcus. The emperor gave the keynote to his life in the last word that he uttered when the tribune of the night watch came to ask the password equanimitas. He then turned over, as if going to sleep, and died. His death closed out the longest reign since Augustus, surpassing Tiberius by a couple of months. After Antoninus died in 161, Marcus was effectively sole ruler of the empire. The formalities of the position would follow. The Senate would soon grant him the name Augustus and the title Imperator, and he would soon be formally elected as Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the official cults. Marcus made some show of resistance. The biographer writes that he was compelled to take imperial power. This may have been a genuine horror imperii, fear of imperial power. Marcus, with his preference for the philosophic life, found the imperial office unappealing. His training as a Stoic, however, had made the choice clear that it was his duty. Although Marcus showed no personal affection for Hadrian, he presumably believed it his duty to enact the man's succession plans. Thus, although the Senate planned to confirm Marcus alone, he refused to take office unless Lucius received equal powers. The Senate accepted, granting Lucius the imperium, the tribunician power, and the name Augustus. Marcus became, in official titulature, Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. Lucius, foregoing his name Commodus and taking Marcus' family name Verus, became Imperator Caesar Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus. It was the first time that Rome was ruled by two emperors. In spite of their nominal equality, Marcus held more auctoritas, or authority, than Lucius. He had been consul once more than Lucius, he had shared in Antoninus' rule, and he alone was Pontifex Maximus. It would have been clear to the public which emperor was the more senior. As the biographer wrote, Verus obeyed Marcus, as a lieutenant obeys a proconsul or a governor obeys the emperor. Immediately after their Senate confirmation, the emperors proceeded to the Castra Praetoria, the camp of the Praetorian Guard. Lucius addressed the assembled troops, which then acclaimed the pair as imperators. Then, like every new emperor since Claudius, Lucius promised the troops a special donative. This donative, however, was twice the size of those past, 20,000 sesterces per capita, with more to officers. In return for this bounty, equivalent to several years' pay, the troops swore an oath to protect the emperors. The ceremony was perhaps not entirely necessary, given that Marcus' accession had been peaceful and unopposed, but it was good insurance against later military troubles. Upon his accession he also devalued the Roman currency. He decreased the silver purity of the denarius from 83.5% to 79%, the silver weight dropping from 2.68 grams to 2.57 grams. Antoninus' funeral ceremonies were, in the words of the biographer, elaborate. If his funeral followed those of his predecessors, his body would have been incinerated on a pyre at the Campus Martius, and his spirit would have been seen as ascending to the gods' home in the heavens. Marcus and Lucius nominated their father for deification. In contrast to their behavior during Antoninus' campaign to deify Hadrian, the Senate did not oppose the emperor's wishes. A flamen, or cultic priest, was appointed to minister the cult of the deified Divus Antoninus. Antoninus' remains were laid to rest in Hadrian's mausoleum, beside the remains of Marcus' children and of Hadrian himself. The temple he had dedicated to his wife, Diva Faustina, became the temple of Antoninus and Faustina. It survives as the Church of San Lorenzo in Miranda. In accordance with his will, Antoninus' fortune passed on to Faustina. Faustina was 3 months pregnant at her husband's accession. During the pregnancy she drew